On the 20th of February 1939, Madison Square Garden hosted one of the most chilling spectacles in American history, the German American Bund's largest ever rally. They were America's Nazis, a fact laid bare by the particulars of their display, one that saw the nation's most famous stadium draped in banners that bore both the swastika and George Washington, the two standing side by side in a union that was every bit as unholy as it was contradictory. And the man in the high castle motifs were not simply limited to the walls too. It's down on the ground, brown shirts who spoke English with a native tongue marched through the aisles as supporters. 20,000 of them, in fact, all raised their arms in a unified Nazi salute. At the centre of it all was Fritz Kuhn, the leader of the Bund, who, in a very Hitlerian manner, proclaimed his loyalty to both the United States and Nazi Germany, whilst also throwing in all the usual National Socialist talking points of Aryan supremacy, as well as anti-Semitism and anti-communism. It was a sight that was so, well, bizarre that it beggars belief that knowledge of both Madison Square Garden rally specifically and the Bund more generally has slipped through the cracks of history and found itself relegated to a mere footnote in the overarching story of fascism. Worry not, however, because today we're going to be dragging the story out of the darkness and recounting to you the otherwise forgotten and untold story of America's Nazis. So let's begin. The Bund, as we will continue calling it to keep things simple, was founded on the 19th of March 1936, outwardly as but a humble heritage association aimed at unifying German Americans under their shared ethnic and cultural identity. It also didn't just appear out of the ether, with it instead having its roots in the Friends of New Germany, an organisation which, as the name suggests, was an outright and openly pro-Nazi one, with it in fact having been founded by Heinz Spanknobel, a German immigrant and literal card-carrying Nazi, under direct instruction from Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. It only lasted from 1933 to 35, however. Hess, having given up on the organisation as a dud, recalled its leadership back to Germany and ordered its members to leave of their own accord. It was simply too openly pro-Nazi, you see, and as a result, basically the entire American media and state-controlled apparatus immediately turned on it the moment it left the gate, totally neutering it as a vessel for exerting soft political power in the US, despite having a not at all insignificant membership of nearly 10,000 individuals. From there, it was back to the drawing board, and it was decided that if Nazism was to take root in the US, American Nazis would have to play the game and be much more subtle in their approach. Thus, the Bund was founded in 1936, outwardly as a heritage association, but just as one that always just so happened to find the current state of things in Germany agreeable. This was quite a thin veil as far as they went, and you'd struggle to find anyone in 1936 who wasn't acutely aware of the Bund's true nature, but it was a veil, nonetheless. And as the rise of Nazism in Germany proper proved, get yourself a line to blag, a suitably charismatic bloke to do said blagging, and doors can suddenly start opening for any aspiring extremist. As for who the Bund's smooth talking point man was to be, that would be Fritz Kuhn, a German-born World War I veteran who had found himself naturalized as an American citizen in 1934. His leadership of the Bund was actually quite the competent one too, as he took multiple different approaches to begin building and solidifying its base. One approach, for example, saw him ripping pages straight from Hitler's playbook and talking about the economic struggles of the Great Depression and how the solution to them lay in the embracing of National Socialism. This line in particular went down really well, as at that time there was a genuine belief in the Nazi economic miracle that had ended poverty and unemployment in Germany and restored dignity to the land. We of course know now that the miracle was but a sham, as Germany was essentially a country living on credit card debt during the Nazi period, but to some German Americans, all they saw was their family back in the fatherland seemingly having a grand old time of it, and so they wanted a bit of that for themselves. But Kuhn also tailored his messaging for the unique situation of German Americans, and so strayed from the Hitler playbook quite substantially in other areas. For example, he capitalized on the lingering prejudices German Americans dealt with from World War I, which were only getting worse in the 1930s thanks to a renewed surge of nativism in the US, and said that through National Socialism, German Americans had a way to stand unified in the face of this prejudice, better able to weather and defeat as a whole greater than the sum of its individual parts. Kuhn also established a highly organized and disciplined movement, with the Bund dividing the US into 3 major geographic regions, or Gauss, each of which was subdivided again into local posts. These posts served as hubs for Bund activities, hosting regular meetings, rallies, and social events designed to foster solidarity among members. And while we are on the subject of discipline and regimentation, Kuhn naturally also adopted a militarized and uniformed structure for the organization, just like the Nazis proper had back in Germany. He even established his own equivalent of the SA, the kepi-clad street hoodlums who had been so invaluable to Hitler in his own ascent to power. Calling them the Ordnungsdienst, or OD, translating roughly as orderly service, they functioned as the Bund's paramilitary arm, providing security at events and enforcing internal order. Dressed in uniforms reminiscent of the Nazi SA, albeit with the iconic kepi swapped out for a side cap to American that look up a bit, OD members underwent training in marching, self-defense, and basic combat techniques. This paramilitary presence, along with the use of Nazi symbols and rituals, reinforced the Bund's image as a well-ordered and ideologically committed group, though it also alarmed many Americans who viewed such displays as both unpatriotic and threatening. Youth programs were also a key component of the Bund's strategy for growth and indoctrination. Modeled after the Hitler Youth, the Bund's youth camps offered a mix of recreational activities, cultural instruction, and ideological education. Children and teenagers participated in sports, camping, and traditional German folk activities, all while being exposed to propaganda extolling the virtues of National Socialism. Come the late 1930s, the Bund's influence had extended across much of the country, with a particularly strong presence in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Estimates of its membership peaked between 20,000 and 25,000, which may sound like a lot, but do remember that this represented only a tiny fraction of the wider German American population, which numbered in the many, many millions. So that's great and all, but what did the Bund actually do apart from just playing dress up and hosting rallies? Well, local posts organised cultural events, including German festivals, dances, and lectures, which provided a sense of belonging for members and reinforced their shared identity. These gatherings also served as recruitment opportunities, drawing in German Americans who may have initially been interested in celebrating their heritage, but were gradually exposed to the Bund's broader ideological message. By embedding itself in the fabric of German American communities, the Bund created a network of individuals who could be mobilized for its larger political objectives. Propaganda efforts also kept the Bund busy. In addition to its own newspaper, Deutsche Wachricht und Beobachter, or German Wake Up Call and Observer, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation there, the organization also distributed flyers, posters, and pamphlets that extolled the virtues of National Socialism while warning of the dangers posed by their perceived enemies. They also made use of film and radio, mediums that allowed them to reach wider audiences. Their propaganda, as you no doubt expected, often emphasized the idea that Jews were responsible for global economic woes and political instability, echoing the rhetoric of the Nazi regime. This messaging was designed not only to rally existing supporters, but also to sow division and mistrust within the broader American populace. But all of that was just set dressing for the real main activity of the Bund, influencing politics. Members were encouraged to support local policies and candidates sympathetic to their cause, and the organization maintained close surveillance of political developments in both the US and Germany. And that pretty much is it for what they got up to. Lots of playing dress up and marching about, lots of screeching, and that's about it. We harvested JSTOR for sources that we could use for today, and although we gathered a fair bit, we weren't able to find any particular references to violent incidences like you might imagine from Nazis, battering political opponents, putting Jewish storefronts through, setting up machine guns at voting booths, things like that. Instead, it seems they were just a bunch of wet whingers. Perhaps this is why even the proper German Nazis didn't like them, a sentiment which is best encapsulated by the fact that Kuhn and a few of the Bund's top men made the trip to Berlin for the 1936 Olympics and even managed to get a picture with Hitler in the Reich Chancellery. As for why this demonstrates the full sugar Nazis' contempt for their diet soda American counterparts, the meeting wasn't exactly what you'd call an enthusiastic one. Put it this way, remember back in 2023 when Salt Bae pushed his way onto the pitch of the World Cup final to force himself into some photos? Well, give Messi a more questionable taste in facial hair and Salt Bae a little armband, and that's pretty much how the Bund's meeting with Hitler went down. We've already seen that the Bund only found limited popularity even among its target demographic of German Americans. But in what will no doubt come as a surprise to absolutely nobody, it was even less popular among other demographics, either because they were directly targeted as an enemy by the Bund's propaganda, as was the case with Jewish Americans, or simply because they found the regressive values that they exalted so deplorable that they became enemies of the Bund through conviction. This led to the forming of a significant opposition bloc to the Bund, one that came from multiple fronts and would eventually include grassroots activists, organised labour, political leaders, Jewish groups and federal agencies, all of whom sought to counter the Bund's influence and prevent its spread. Public demonstrations were among the most visible forms of opposition to the Bund. Anti-fascist groups, Jewish organisations and local communities often staged protests outside Bund events, often leading to violent clashes. For example, the infamous rally at Madison Square Garden in 1939 drew not only 20,000 Bund supporters, but also thousands of counter-demonstrators who gathered outside the venue. They chanted slogans, waved banners condemning fascism, and engaged in scuffles with both the Bund themselves and the police, who, as long as things remained peaceful, were then willing to let the Bund have their right to free speech. That, incidentally, also brings up the question that both historians and contemporaries have been grappling with ever since the Bund's formation. Where does free speech end and public safety begin? Most of those officers, for example, were not sympathetic to the Bund at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. But they were also the products of a nation rooted in the English liberal tradition, one that, through thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, holds that the free exchange of ideas is crucial, even when those ideas are offensive or harmful, because it fosters societal progress, and so, while doing so certainly made them uncomfortable, they believed that the Bund had a right to express itself in a venue that had consented to host them. Many would disagree with this, of course, and you don't even have to leave liberalism to find such opinions, as Benjamin Constant of the French liberal tradition argued that there ought to be a balance between liberalism and order, lest society descend into dangerous tyranny. Either way, we'll leave the choice on how to interpret the police's actions in your hands, as this is a history video, not a philosophy one. So we simply want you to be aware of this debate that existed at the time and today in the literature, rather than trying to force feed you any one interpretation of a matter that is very, very subjective after all. And bringing it back to the matter at hand, that being opposition to the Bund, it should come as no surprise for you to learn that the myriad of groups that stood against them, Jewish groups were by far the most organised, vocal and numerous in their efforts. Come the Madison Square Garden rally, after all, it was 1939, and so the Holocaust was already underway in its nascent stages, with German Jews having been stripped of citizenship under the 1935 Nuremberg laws and subjected to Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in 1938, a violent pogrom that saw 91 of them killed, upwards of 30,000 of them sent to concentration camps, and 7,000 of their businesses destroyed. The Jewish American response to the Bund was also very well organised, with groups such as the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League focusing their resources in order to monitor the Bund's activities, collect intelligence on its members, and run media efforts to counter its anti-Semitic propaganda. As for the role of the American labour movement in countering the Bund, both unions and labour activists, many of whom were aligned with leftist or socialist ideologies, viewed the Bund as a direct threat to workers' rights and democratic values. Much like how Jewish Americans looked at Nazi Germany and put themselves in the shoes of their kin trapped over there, labour activists too looked over at Nazi Germany, saw how Hitler had treated their German equivalents, and decided the matter was a personal one for them. In particular, they noted how Hitler had forcibly disbanded all trade unions in May 1933 and replaced them with a Deutsche Arbeitsfront, or German Labour Front, a Nazified union of sorts that did whatever the party told it to, in addition to also begin the mass detention of communists in the concentration camps from February of that same year, and that was more than enough to convince them that they did not want National Socialism taking root in the US. As for what they did in response, counter-rallies and protests were very much the done thing, of course, but labour groups such as the Congress of Industrial Organisations also channeled their resources into more organised and better coordinated efforts, much like how the Anti-Defamation League had done on behalf of Jewish organisations, with specific actions involving things like organising boycotts of industrialists and industrial concerns, found to be sympathetic to the Bund, as well as publishing key materials on the Bund's efforts to infiltrate labour unions so that their members could remain better vigilant. Then there were the politicians who took up the anti-Bund mantle. Since there's more politicians and opinions held thereby than there are grains of sand on a beach, it's hard to sum up their efforts in any unified manner, as we did for resistance from both Jewish and organised labour groups, so instead, let's keep it simple. If a politician happened to find themselves with a flowering hatred of the Bund, be it for simple reasons of ideological conviction, or for having a horse in the race, as it were, they would simply levy all that they were legally able to attempt to stop, or at the very least harry, their activities. Take New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia as an example, as he was by far one of the most outspoken critics of the Bund, and not just among politicians, but period. While he acknowledged the Bund's right to free speech and assembly under the Constitution, he also recognised his right as a custodian of the peace to put a few preventative measures in place, monitoring their gatherings with plain-clothed agents and making sure that while his police wouldn't gag the Bund's tongues, they'd be on them like a ton of bricks if their words ever began to be translated into action. Further still, he also organised his right to fire back with words of his own, publicly denouncing their activities and organising counter-demonstrations as a free citizen, just one who happened to be very famous and thus had a lot of media attention on him. Similarly, District Attorney Thomas Dewey also pursued legal action against Bund leaders Al Capone style, i.e. we aren't going to trump up charges, but we're going to throw the book for anything we are able. This led Kuhn picking up charges for larceny and forgery for embezzling $14,548, around $350,000 today, from the Bund in December 1939, for which he received a custodial sentence of a minimum of 2.5 years. But it wasn't just local politicians who opposed the Bund, as the federal government also got involved, and with them very much believing that American involvement in the war against Nazi Germany was not a matter of if, but when, they were much more concerned about the practical realities of state security, which in more streamlined terms meant they wanted the Bund nipped in the bud, lest they become a subversive fifth column when the inevitable happened. With that in mind, the House Un-American Activities Committee, an investigative committee of the United States House of Representatives, launched investigations into the organisation seeking to uncover its connections to Nazi Germany and its subversive activities within the United States. This revealed the Bund's financial ties to German entities and its efforts to spread Nazi propaganda. The Roosevelt administration, in response, directed federal agencies to keep a close watch on the group's activities, with the FBI conducting surveillance, infiltrating Bund meetings, and gathering evidence to support prosecutions against its leaders and members. So yeah, it's fair to say then that the Bund didn't exactly have many friends in the US, and that segues us nicely to something else quite interesting for us to consider. As you might expect, the Bund got significant attention from the American media, and it was pretty much all negative too. From sensational headlines to scathing editorials, journalists the US over framed the Bund as a dangerous domestic threat, and they went on the attack. Newspaper coverage, for example, often depicted the Bund in alarmist tones, with headlines like "Nazi Army on American Soil" and "Fifth Column Rising." These articles detailed the Bund's rallies, such as the infamous 1939 one in Madison Square Garden, emphasizing the swastika banners, militaristic displays, and anti-Semitic rhetoric. This imagery struck a chord, drawing parallels to Hitler's regime and raising fears of fascism taking root in the United States. Fritz Kuhn naturally became a focal point of press scrutiny. Journalists highlighted his flamboyant persona, his claims of loyalty to American ideas, and his overt promotion of Nazi principles. His later legal troubles, including embezzlement charges, further solidified his portrayal as corrupt and untrustworthy, discrediting the Bund's leadership. Editorials in prominent newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post amplified these concerns. They questioned whether America's commitment to free speech could withstand the rise of domestic fascism, urging stronger government action against the Bund. This public debate over the balance between civil liberties and security mirrored broader societal tensions, with some advocating for stricter oversight, while others warned against compromising their democratic principles. Public letters to editors reflected the polarized reactions. Many condemned the Bund and demanded tighter restriction on its activities, while others criticized local authorities for permitting rallies like the one at Madison Square Garden, arguing that such tolerance emboldened fascist elements. The media thus served as a conduit for widespread public outrage, fostering a national discourse on the threat posed by the Bund. Radio broadcasts, still quite the new thing at the time, also played their part, bringing vivid descriptions of Bund activities directly into American homes. News programs and interviews with anti-Bund activists, Holocaust survivors, and political leaders condemned the organization and its ideology. These broadcasts reinforced the perception of the Bund as an existential threat to American values. Despite the overwhelmingly critical coverage, some isolationist and pro-German outlets did actually offer some more sympathetic portrayals, framing the Bund as a cultural organization unfairly maligned by its critics. However, such voices were rare and were largely drowned out by the dominant anti-Bund narrative. So, how did it all end? Well, it wasn't even a America has joined the war now, so off you will go to prison, lads type situation, as the Bund had long since shot itself in the foot come that time. You see, it very much was an organisation built around the charisma of one man, that being Kuhn, and when he went to prison, the Bund fell apart. New leaders came and went with great rapidity, and all the while they proved to be so incompetent that they stacked up more and more scandals that made it ever harder for the Bund to freely operate. With a particularly notable one being when Gerhard Kunze, the then leader, began instructing Bund members on how to dodge the draft following conscription's reintroduction on September 1940. That, it turned out, was a major crime, and so he fled to Mexico to dodge a 15-year jail sentence. Such mismanagement left the Bund in a shocking state, bleeding members and eventually existing basically only as a paper organization and debating society for its more ideologically devout members. Eventually, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and German declaration of war in December 1941, the few members who were left just dissolved the Bund, and they reasoned that there was now not much to be gained besides an espionage charge or two. And so ended the story of America's Nazis.